Welcome back to The Truth About the Market. I'm Jason Zilberbrand, president of VREF, longtime aviation appraiser, and someone who's spent more than 3 decades living and breathing this industry. I've worked with everyone from celebrity aircraft owners to Fortune 50 flight departments. I've testified as an expert witness in federal court, and I've watched more market cycles than I can count. Before we get started, a quick reminder. This podcast is 100% independent. There's no sponsors, there's no advertisers, there's no paid opinions. What you'll hear is the truth, unfiltered and uninfluenced. And today's truth is a big one. What we're going to talk about today is the great engine shortage, how it started, why it's getting worse, and why your engine program might not actually protect you the way you think it does. Everywhere you look, aircraft are grounded. Shops are full, and owners are waiting months and months, sometimes years for overhauls, parts, or exchanges. We haven't even talked about loaner engines. This isn't just a nuisance. It's a fundamental threat to the liquidity value and to the operation of the global business aviation fleet. And so, let's unpack it. What's happened? And how did we get here? And more importantly, what can you do about it? Well, here's what happened. The great engine crunch. If you tried to schedule an overhaul recently or get a loaner or even try and get a borescope, you already know the market is chaos. Lead times are brutal. Costs are climbing. MROs are running triage. They prioritize whoever screams the loudest or whoever writes the biggest check or sometimes who's just the most important, right? And in some cases, operators are being told, we'll put you on a list for next quarter. But this didn't come out of nowhere. The current engine shortage is a result of years of compounding problems, and it collided with global shock, and now, even 5 years later, we're still paying the price. So let's break down that perfect storm. COVID was a massive disruption. When the world shut down in 2020, the OEM slowed production, overhaul shops downsized, and suppliers, they pivoted to survival mode. And thousands upon thousands of skilled technicians took early retirement or left aviation for good. And when demand came roaring back, the workforce just wasn't there. So the supply chains broke down. Engines worth millions of dollars have been grounded over $2 parts. Bearings, seals, fan blades, vanes. Small specialized items stuck in logistics limbo. And then, to make matters worse, we had OEM prioritizing airlines. Because let's be honest, the airlines got first dibs on everything. The commercial sector represented 90% of the engine volume, so the corporate and private operators found themselves at the bottom of the list. And with certification and labor, even when parts are available, the FAA paperwork and inspection backlogs add months. There's just no fast lane. There's no fast track. So the result is engines everywhere, waiting for parts that either A, don't exist, or B, waiting for technicians who aren't available. What used to be a 90-day shop visit has turned into 6 months. For new engines like CF34s and Pratt 300s or even the HTF 7000, turnaround times can now exceed 200 days. These aren't abstract numbers. That's an aircraft out of service. That's a charter business losing revenue or a corporate flight department that has to rewrite their schedule over and over and over again. And it's also forcing people to reconsider who they do business with and whether or not they're on engine programs. Well, we'll talk more about that later. There's just systematic weak points, and that's how we got here. The shortage just didn't expose cracks. It exposed the fragility of the entire maintenance ecosystem. And with OEM control and consolidation over the last 2 decades, major OEMs have gotten very aggressive consolidating the aftermarket. Independent repair shops were either acquired or they were priced out by intellectual property restrictions and tooling control. If you operate a modern turbine engine, chances are there's only 1 or 2 authorized overhaul centers on the planet to do the work for you. That's not competition. That's captivity. It's a monopoly. And without competitors offering maintenance, there's nothing an owner and operator can do. Literally nothing. Because budgets all of a sudden no longer matter. And you know what's worse? We all talk about it, but there doesn't seem to be anyone having any luck dealing with the OEMs. And so engine programs, well, they mask the problem, right? Power by the hour programs smooth over escalating costs. We talked about this on other podcasts. how engine programs can be a hedge against the market and against inflation. Well, The Power by the Hour programs that smoothed over those escalating costs and gave owners a false sense of security, but they also created capacity, because the programs, they can't conjure up technicians, they can't create parts, they can't make test cells, they can't create loaner engines. Oh boy, they can't create loaner engines. So when the entire market surged back at one time, everyone discovered that coverage with an engine program does not equal availability. I've seen a number of clients who have been forced to purchase new engines because there were no loaners and no technicians to repair their old ones. So that isn't a one-off issue either. It's becoming a trend. And the more people I talk about or talk about this issue to, I'm seeing a lot of the same responses. A lot of people are complaining they just can't get loaner engines. So during the pandemic, operators started deferring expensive events. It made sense then, right? An aircraft wasn't flying. People didn't want to spend the money to support it. But when the travel rebounded, everyone came back to the shops at the same time. And that simultaneous demand spike overwhelmed the system. And so now the ripple effects have hit values, because planes with fresh engines, they command huge premiums. Aircraft with run out engines are discounted heavily. The delta between turnkey and waiting for overhaul, well, those aircraft, that delta with those aircraft has never been larger. And in some case, the price is secondary to just how long it takes to sell an aircraft that is due maintenance in today's market. Because unlike 5 years ago, the market has changed and the values have dropped, making the cost of overhauls even more alarming. And that's before you even account for the lost opportunity, which is downtime. So, you got to think about this. You see aircraft listed all the time, piston aircraft with an engine that's either had a top overhaul. We're going to talk about top overhauls, or is due an overhaul, and it's a smoking deal. Chances are you are not going to get that piston engine overhauled anytime soon. And maybe you go then to start looking at factory reman or new engines. And I guess I should tell you now, good luck, because I'm having a hard time finding them. When clients are asking me to run numbers, there's so few new aircraft engines available for sale. There's so little inventory out there. So what I want to do is now talk about a real world example, because when a shortage becomes a safety issue, that's when we have a crisis. And nowhere is the system more fragile or more visible or even more tragic than it is with the CF34 engine series, particularly, what we've seen recently with the 604 fleet. In February of 2024, for those of you who don't know, a Challenger 604 that was being operated by Hoppajet attempted an emergency landing on Interstate 75 near Naples, Florida. Both engines failed, the aircraft was destroyed, and 2 pilots lost their lives. The crew reported that they lost both engines moments before impact, and subsequent investigations and lawsuits allege corrosion and binding in the variable guide vane system, which is part of the CF34-3B's high-pressure compressor, and that led to a compressor stall and flameouts on both sides. And this event triggered industry-wide scrutiny. By June of 2025, GE issued a service bulletin, which is 72-0347-R00. And what that service bulletin does is it requires the inspection of all CF34-3 series engines for corrosion in the compressor case boreholes. Now, we have talked about corrosion, killing deals, and other podcasts. But this is very serious, folks. This is an absolute deal killer for most people that are dealing with this model aircraft right now, or for any model that has these engines hung on them, because the SB is effective for all CF34s, 1As, 3As, 3A2s, 3A1s, and 3Bs. And it's effective for any engine that entered into service prior to July 2024. And the service bulletin inspection target is based on engine utilization. So GE is saying to comply within 12 months for engines with utilization less than 250 hours a year. And for higher utilization operators, they're suggesting that you do this service bulletin every 24 months. So engines that are not in service or will be changed or swapped from aircraft should be inspected before further flights. And I think that, All of a sudden, shops were suddenly inundated with unscheduled inspections for all these CF34s. And every inspection meant an engine out of service, a new part had to be ordered, another slot taken, an already overbooked facility. You know, this is how safety events and supply shortages intertwine. You have a single high profile accident which cascades into mandatory maintenance that consumes scarce capacity, further driving delays and costs. And so if you're a 604 and 605 operator or a 650 operator or a 601 operator, this has real financial implications, right? Insurance companies, lenders, buyers, they all ask for proof now of compliance with this service bulletin. And if you are buying one of these aircraft and this is the first time you're hearing about it, well, I probably just saved you a boatload of money. And you should go and read and see what's going on with this engine because it's a big deal. There's more CF34s out there. Between the airlines, regional jets, and the business jet, there's thousands of them. So it's a pretty big deal. Anyway, CF34 engine that hasn't been inspected, post-service bulletin, it loses not only the confidence, but it loses value. So what happened? Why did the backlogs and all of these higher expenses and all this capacity, what really happened? Well, the global engine MRO turnaround times, they're up 35% for legacy engines and 150% for new generation models. It's not temporary, folks. This is a structural issue. There's a few things going on, and we talked about them. Part shortages. But specifically, alloys, castings, seals, vanes, they're still in short supply, and shops are literally cannibalizing donor engines to complete other overhauls. We talked about labor shortages. It's driving everything up because experienced technicians are retiring and the training pipelines haven't recovered. It takes years to grow a qualified power plant mechanic. Side note here, if you're young and you're listening to this, or if you're looking for a new career, if you're considering a career in aviation, it's a win-win. Our industry is so badly in need of mechanics and technicians. Now is the time to consider trade school. I swear to you, it will be a brilliant move. And like I said, it's a win-win because we need an influx of new talent to start dealing with the maintenance of these aircraft. The other drivers, and we talked about this too, inflation. No brainer, right? Raw materials, freight, wages, everything's gone up probably 40% in the last 3 years. Slot scarcity. Shops are now booked out so far in advance. If you miss your reserve slot, you could wait another year to get back in. My local shop has so many engines on their shop floor that it could take them years just to get through what they already have on their floor. And that doesn't even account for what's outside. The largest MROs are operating at full capacity. Shop slots, they're booked months and months in advance. Turnaround times that once averaged 90 days, they can easily exceed 6 months, especially if it's being driven by parts, that are in short supply, or if you have an aircraft that has labor constraints, right? So with no excess capacity in the system, operators are being forced to plan major events far, far earlier than ever before. And this isn't deferring maintenance, right? No one's telling you to defer maintenance. It's just about scheduling smarter. You got to, secure your slots ahead of time. Those long lead items that everybody knows, you're probably going to have to bump up when you're starting to order this stuff so that you can avoid extended downtime. This supply imbalance, it's created a new kind of market for engines. Owners are acquiring low-time or freshly overhauled aircraft engines from parted-out aircraft. I'm seeing people keep aircraft engines on aircraft that are going to be parted out, so they have a rolling test cell. Engines that once sold for $500,000 a piece are trading well over $1 million, especially if it's available immediately and there's documentation, because that's the new reality in business aviation. Uptime's the ultimate currency. So here's some examples of engines that are increasing in value. The HTF 7000s, and they're used on, Challengers, the 300, the 350, the 3500. They're also on the Gulfstream 280. It's in strong demand. And there's just very, very few loaners and very few spares out there. We talked about the CF34, especially the 3B. I'm hearing all sorts of issues with loaner engines, and those engines are going up in value. And then legacy turboprop and turbine engines that are still in wide use, like the 731s and even 331s, the old Garretts, even though they're older, the scarcity of ready to run units means that some of these are getting, the premiums are being priced in, assuming that the engine's in the right condition. So again, why is this happening? Scarcity of cores, scarcity of spares. When there's fewer engines available, the good ones, they fetch a premium. And high demand aircraft types are causing engines that are, that are powering more desirable models. They become more valuable because those airframes themselves remain in high demand. So there's definitely a correlation between power plants and the aircraft that they are being hung on, right? So really good to look at this in the piston market because there are engines that are hung on all different types of aircraft, but the ones that have super popular models that they're being hung on, those engines themselves are going to be in far more demand. Maintenance and inspection status. So engines that have completed recent, major service bulletins or ADs, like we talked about with the 3Bs or corrosion, they're also going to draw a premium because downtime cost is super high. Because the cost of being grounded is so high, operators are sometimes willing to pay more for engines that are ready to operate. It minimizes their AOG risk. It increases, their ability to operate that aircraft reliably. And documentation, again and again and again, I bring this up because I think we have to beat it into people, but, traceable history, logbooks, all of these things help the value of, yes, even an engine, because the airlines, they're not going to take an engine from some operator that doesn't have back to birth traceability. And for business jet owners, they're not going to buy an engine from anybody. You'd be surprised how many parts are out there from aircraft that have been salvaged, right? And sometimes those salvages due to accidents and crashes. People are very, very careful about where they're buying those parts and where they're coming from. So that's why documentation is so important. A couple examples on the piston side of engines that I've seen just go completely haywire in terms of pricing. Like look at the Lycoming TIO, the 540 series as an example. I don't even know that you'll be able to get one. But if you did, a brand new one or a factory reman, it's going to be like $140,000, $150,000. IO 550 is another one, super popular engine. It is on so many different models, including the SR22s. I remember, and I'm sure you all do too, where you could get, overhauls for 50, 60K. I mean, those days are over. Now it's probably closer to 80, 85. Rebuilt units, 100,000. Many of these units are on back order or even out of stock. I mean, I can't even tell you how many times I go to look at pricing on the same old websites that everybody else does, and everything's out of stock. So pricing for higher displacement or turbocharged variants is also significantly higher than base models. That's a no-brainer, but sometimes it's because of all those accessories, right? Those accessories are driving the price. And something that I think comes up all the time, or at least I get questioned with new users to VREF, is what's the difference between overhauls and rebuilds and factory new and factory reman? Well, the difference from a definition standpoint, I'm going to save for another podcast because I think it's that important. But you need to know from a valuation standpoint, they are not equals, right? You have to know what you're dealing with. If it's just a factory overhaul versus a factory reman, keep in mind VREF uses factory overhauls, or just field overhauls. Sorry, not factory overhauls, but field overhauls. And so, if you're going to deal with a rebuilt or a factory new engine, you need to give yourself appropriate credit. And if you don't know what to use, contact me. But my suggestion would be to to look at that very carefully and make sure that the aircraft that you're valuing, that it's apples to apples, because these engines are getting so expensive. You may find that the delta was because you skipped this or you missed it. It's not anything else. So it's really important you pay attention to it. Did you know VREF does more appraisals than anyone else in the market? With thousands of aircraft appraisals completed every year, why trust anybody else? Go to vref.com to learn more. the scarcity and the stock issues and some engines being, not even available to order, it creates value for those that have them and they're ready to go. If you're tired of guessing about aircraft values, try VREF Online. Real-time data, quarterly updates, and over 900 models at your fingertips, from residual value forecasts to depreciation trends. It's the platform trusted by lenders, insurance companies, and professionals worldwide. Subscribe today at vref.com and start making decisions based on facts, not feelings. So let's jump to engine programs, because this topic comes up over and over and over again. And I want to go over some myths and I want to go over some maths. Engine programs were designed to bring predictability to unpredictable expenses. And so you pay a fixed amount per flight hour, and in return, these programs pay for your overhaul when it comes due. And it sounds great, but in today's market, predictability and protection are two very different things. So let's separate fact from fiction. What engine programs actually cover? So programs like Rolls-Royce Corporate Care, GE On Point, Pratt & Whitney ESP, Honeywell MSP, they cover the financial cost of scheduled maintenance. They're not designed to guarantee availability. They're not designed to guarantee turnaround time. And they're not designed to guarantee spare engines or loaners, even though that's what they say they do. If the shop is full, you're still going to have to wait. If the part is on back order, you're still going to be, grounded. But this is the case with every program, whether it's one of the OEMs or it's one of the independents like JSSI or EAP. It used to be that the OEMs would guarantee loaner support, but post-COVID, that's just isn't happening. And independent programs that don't own enough loaners will face the same issue, if not more, because as the OEMs play favorites to their own contracts before taking care of others, this is really becoming problematic. And I think that, based on the conversations that I have with operators every day, this really is becoming almost a secondary pandemic. It would be nice if you knew when you signed the contract how many loaner engines were available for the fleet. But that type of data isn't available, right? There isn't any transparency with that. So what you have to do is you got to read the fine print and the exclusions. And many owners don't read the exclusions until it's too late. Most of these programs don't cover FOD, or foreign object damage. Most of them don't cover corrosion. None of them cover misuse, right? None of them are going to cover things when, like, you miss a payment or you're non-compliance with ADs, right? And if you are not flying minimums, well, they're going to bill you for that as well. If you're not current on your invoices, by the way, your peace of mind, that contract becomes a very expensive piece of paper, because the minimums are an easy way for you to determine if you can afford that aircraft. Keep in mind, if you're not able to fly the minimums, you're still going to be billed for them, right? We talked about that. But that's part of the fine print and part of the exclusions. So when you have an OEM program versus an independent, what are the differences? Well, OEM programs are trusted, but they're very rigid. Independent programs can be flexible, but they vary widely in credibility, and neither eliminates the risk of downtime. They just reallocate who pays for it, right? So things have changed with coverage as well. And I alluded to this earlier about corrosion. As an example, Corporate Care Enhanced. Well, that contract is now a term contract. It runs for 10 years. And if the aircraft is sold before the end of that period, they can switch to a new contract. According to Rolls, they say operators covered by their contracts receive 35% more value in terms of the maintenance costs they would incur if not covered. And, because Rolls is paying those expenses out of pocket, well, it probably makes sense, right? I mean, and I'm a big fan of Power by the Hour, and I'm a huge fan of engine programs because we've talked about this. It is pay now or pay later. And when you pay now with a program, it becomes affordable because you're paying for each hour in the rears. But things are changing, and so let's talk about what's going on, because you're going to start hearing about something called preventative maintenance. And this isn't new. Preventative maintenance in business aviation is evolved. And it's it's really pretty cool what's going on in our industry, and I don't think anybody's talking about it. But there's a lot of data, there's a lot of connectivity, and there's a ton of OEM-backed programs now designed to anticipate problems before they occur, right? So Bombardier has smart services, Gulfstream has Fast and Plane Connect HTM, Dassault has Falcon Care and Falcon Scan, Embraer has a Head Pro, Textron's Pro Advantage is also becoming more integrated with real-time aircraft health monitoring and predictive analytics. And so when you put this into your maintenance framework, these systems, they're there to collect continuous in-flight data from thousands of sensors across the airframe, the engines, the avionics. And then that information is analyzed instantly. So it allows maintenance teams to detect performance trends, predict component wear, and they can plan service events before an issue grounds the aircraft. It just makes total sense, right? So when you pair this with an hourly cost program and OEM maintenance coverage, this approach minimizes unscheduled downtime, and it'll improve your dispatch reliability. Preventative maintenance is no longer reactive, it's strategic. OEMs use these programs to deliver life cycle support, they optimize parts logistics, and they maintain residual value by ensuring aircraft remain fully compliant and operational. For owners and operators, these predictive programs transform maintenance from a cost center into a planning tool where data-driven forecasting keeps aircraft flying safely, efficiently, and profitably, while giving lenders, insurance companies, and buyers greater confidence in the long-term asset performance. Guys, predictive maintenance is the future. Whether or not the independents are able to offer it, that's the question, right? Because these programs are armed with a ton of people who are watching these planes fly in real time, and they sit in a room and they're going through deep dives on analytics. And I don't know if the independents are going to be able to do that. And if they can, are the OEMs going to give the independents access to their sensors and this whole logistics, framework? I don't think so. For years, brokers treated program enrollment as a bulletproof resale advantage. Well, that's changing because buyers care less about whether an aircraft is on a program and more about whether or not the engines are actually ready to operate and whether they can fly. A fresh overhaul will beat an engine program being prepaid every time in this market. So as overhaul costs balloon, so have hourly rates. And so some operators are discovering that the predictable cost has outpaced actual market reality, especially on older airframes. And we've talked about this too, where the residual value just doesn't justify the premiums of being on a program. So we're starting to see a lot of owners exit programs. They take the money, they self-insure. And the bet is that they can manage the risk more efficiently on their own. But we're also seeing alternatives to the normal players in the market whose approach I think is fresh, and it allows for way more flexibility. They focus, on older generation power plants like 731s and Pratt JT15Ds or maybe 305s, but they're providing loaner engines, and they can be really cost effective in assisting operators with older aircraft. So I do think that there's that tug of war constantly with older aircraft and operators and whether or not programs make sense. So what can you do as an operator or an owner or as an aircraft manager, right? What are the strategies that really work to not only survive the shortage, but, to keep that aircraft flying? Well, one, plan ahead. Whether it's a piston aircraft or a business jet, you got to get on the shop's calendar early. And sometimes we're talking a year out, and you got to secure your slot, and you got to pre-order long lead time items. And the way that I tell people to deal with it is put a deposit up, right? It's a smart way of securing your spot. You got money on it. It's not going anywhere. Communicate. Constantly stay in touch with your MRO. Stay in touch with your program rep. Stay in touch with your director of maintenance, right? The lesson here is the size of the plane doesn't matter. The upcoming events do. So stay in touch with the vendors. Make sure that you know of any anticipated bottlenecks. Read the fine print. Understand your exclusions and downtime, right? And even when you're signing a contract to have your plane service with an MRO, read the fine print. Your engine program, read the fine print, right? Also, I think it's really important, and I know piston guys are really good at doing this, especially during the winter months, but you got to think beyond the engines. If your plane's going to be down, you got to use that time wisely. It's a good time to do paint, interior, avionics, Service bulletin compliance. Keep your records. Detailed logs, service reports, service records, proposals, all that correspondence, it protects you. So put it in a file and save it. And then, budget realistically. I think this one is really what it just surprises people between inflation, freight, labor costs, net tariffs. The tariffs are like, it's such a crazy surprise. You got to check on those too. The last thing you want to do is order a part and then find out that you got a bill from FedEx or UPS for 2.5 times what the cost of the part was. I see it every day because it's happening to me. So, from a valuation standpoint, the engine shortage is really rewriting the rules, because the recent overhauls are appreciating, and aircraft with run-out engines, they're being punished, and buyers are trying to factor in downtime into their offers. A jet 200 hours from overhaul might see several price drops, where a similar aircraft with fresh overhauls, it might sell immediately if it ever even gets listed. Banks, they now require updated maintenance forecasts before approving financing. Transparency has become king. A note like engines expected, post-service bulletin, blah, 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 or corrosion-free, it can make or break a deal. Same with piston engines. Top overhauls are often misunderstood, and it can actually hurt an aircraft's value rather than help it. Quick note on top overhauls, it only replaces or repairs components in the upper section of the engine, typically cylinders or pistons or valves, and it leaves the bottom end untouched. It is not a complete overhaul. There is no overhaul sign-off in the logbooks. Critical components like bearings and your crankshaft and connecting rods, they remain uninspected and untouched. Because top overhauls don't reset the time since major overhaul, lenders, insurers, appraisers, we view it as cosmetic maintenance, not true restoration. It doesn't extend your TBO. It doesn't improve your collateral risk. In fact, a top overhaul can signal uneven wear and compression issues, making it a huge red flag for appraisers, financial institutions, and buyers. So there's my 2 cents on the top overhaul, right? But, there's no quick fix. The industry consensus is, at least from an outlook standpoint, that it's going to take another 24 to 36 months to normalize what's been going on. And that's assuming things stay the current course, because labor and supplier recovery, it takes time. And I don't think we're ever going to see costs revert to pre-2020 levels ever again, right? Still, OEMs, independents, everybody's investing in predictive maintenance, AI, logistical support, MROs are expanding. These are all super positive steps. But the near-term pain remains almost unavoidable. The smartest operators are locking in slots early. They're tracking maintenance obsessively. They're treating downtime management as a strategic asset. And my personal advice is, you can never start planning for scheduled maintenance too soon. Well, that's it for today's episode of The Truth About the Market. We covered how the engine shortage happened, what's driving it, how to stay ahead. Preparation beats panic, and the operators planning today will still be flying tomorrow. If you found this episode helpful, share it with your director of maintenance or your broker or your aviation lender. And for more analysis and valuation insight, visit VREF.com. I'm Jason Zilberbrand. I'm a senior aircraft appraiser, and this has been The Truth About the Market. Until next time, fly safe and stay smart.